All right, so still in this chapter 10, we're speaking about the complete tzaddik mainly. That's the highlight of this chapter. A tzaddik that not only has no evil, or that he's evil, he's dormant, maybe like in the incomplete tzaddik, but really this is a man who was able to transform his evil into good. He has not only not one iota of evil, but he's transformed that evil into good, so he has only good, he's wholesomely good. That's really what the chapter is about. Goes on to speak about the different levels. We spoke about the sons of ascent, if you recall, that are planted in each and every generation, because there are very few, these complete tzaddikim that are really the leaders of the generation are very few, and therefore God planted them in each and every generation. He would spread them out. And now we speak about the rest that may have a thirst for God, as he explains, which, by the way, is an expression that he's found quite often in the book of Psalms. When King David expresses his thirst for God, he often uses metaphors like a deer that's by the riverside, who thirst for the water. Kayal taroga lefikei mayim, in Psalm 61, I believe. But this idea of being thirsty for God is true to the soul, and that's true not just for the complete tzaddik, but for each and every one of us, where our soul thirsts for God, our soul thirsts for doing good, for doing God's work in this world. And if we don't quench it, and we remain thirsty, and that thirst bothers us and creates all sorts of negative symptoms. So that's the idea here on page 261. Why don't we just continue, as you mentioned, Margot, bottom of page 261. Okay. But in the manner described.
You want me to read?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Or anyone else, please, yeah.
Okay, but in the manner described in Tikkunei Zohar, who is a chassid? He who is benevolent toward his owner. The Hebrew word chassid means benevolent one. In the Talmud, the term is used to connote an individual of great spiritual stature, equivalent to the complete tzaddik of the Tanya. Excuse me. The Tikkunei Zohar explains that a chassid is one who is benevolent towards his owner, one whose every act is an act of benevolence toward God, whose motive is everything he does is not for his own sake, to achieve attachment and fusion with God, but to fulfill the divine will.
Right. So it's important to note the word chassid is loosely used these days, but chassid in this context comes really from the word chesed, which means kindness or benevolence. And that is because the chassid is someone who goes the extra mile, someone who's kind with his owner. His owner might tell him, do this, he does this and that. Not that he adds to the Torah, but he enhances the Torah. There's a difference. He does that with more heart, with more passion. He does that which God commands him with kindness, with benevolence. You know, it says in the Talmud that there's no comparison between one who studies 100 times and one who studies 101 times. Why? Because going that extra time breaks your limit, breaks your natural barrier. And that is what a chassid does. Someone who's not confined to any limits, but because he's so passionate about God, he's so in love with God, so to speak, he goes the extra mile. He studies 101 times instead of 100 times. And there's a big difference. The Talmud, to make a point here, uses a different analogy, but it uses the analogy of the marketplace of the time, in which it apparently there were donkeys to rent. We have cars to rent. We have other things. Back then it was donkeys. So we have, Ubers, Lyfts. We've upgraded, but back then donkeys. And it would say that in the marketplace, they would say that if you want to use a donkey to go 1 mil, which is a certain distance, let's say 1 mile, then it costs 1 zuz. If you want to go 1 mil and a little bit more, then it costs 2 zuz. Why? It should be 2 meals, 2 zuz. 1 meal, 1 zuz. And the reason is because you're asking the donkey to go beyond his limit. He's breaking some barrier here. And the break of the barrier is it's charging, is why people are charging 2 zuz instead of 1 zuz. There's that extra mile, that extra effort I think marathon runners know this, that apparently when they run, and I ran a marathon once in my life, so I'm no expert here, but there is this point that if you reach it and you exert yourself completely with tremendous focus and exhaustion even, there's that point where the barrier is broken and then it's almost automatic, right? Does anyone run marathons here?
I did.
Okay.
And after the 20th mile, you want to die, but you push through.
You push through. That's right. Elisabetta, isn't there such thing in Italian called punto di nesta?
Punto
Di nesta.
inesta?
Di
No.
nesta. Di nesta. No?
Di nesta? No,
Yeah.
no.
Maybe I thought, yeah. But
Punto
again,
di
so
futura.
yeah. But the point is, again, you go the extra mile. That break of the barrier is really what reflects upon your true devotion to the thing. And this is what a chassid does. He's kind to his creator. His creator might tell him, do this and do this. He says, I'll do this and I'll go all the way with it. And I'll do that and go all the way with it. And won't calculate. And that's why sometimes you would find, as the Talmud says, Hasidim Rishonim, that the first Hasidim, referring to those types of people, would pray for hours and hours and hours. Not that they calculated, okay, today I'm going to pray for 3 hours. Today I'm going to pray for 4. It's just that they were so in love that they flew into this ecstasy. There was no barrier, no limit to their relationship with God. That's a chassid. Someone who's benevolent with his creator. He goes all the way. And in a way, that attribute is shared by the complete tzaddik. A complete tzaddik is so one with God, so again, in love with God, that he stopped his calculations. Okay, I'm going to check the boxes. I'm going to do this today. I'm going to do that today. But I'm going to go all the way. I'm not thinking I'm going to be kind to my creator. It's not about me. It's about my relationship with God. It's about God himself. So he goes all the way. And that's really what it means to be a chassid, benevolent one. It's an interesting expression, but a very important one. Now, what can we take from this? Always, I'm trying to bring it to practicality here, is that sometimes we can't be chassidim all the time, 24/7, or with all the mitzvahs. But we can be a chassid at least with one mitzvah. One mitzvah in which we say, I'm not going to calculate now. I'm not going to check boxes. I'm going to go all the way. If it's prayer for you, then it's prayer for you, like the early chassidim. If it's tzedakah for you, then tzedakah for you. If it's whatever it may be, put it on tefillin, whether it's respecting your parents, go for it. Go all the way by respecting your parents. Whatever mitzvah it is, we can pick at least one mitzvah in which, in that mitzvah, we are chassidim. We are benevolent, we are with our creator. And then slowly but surely add more and more. But really the worst thing, one of the worst expressions in the Talmud, which is it seems maybe a good expression, but it's a very even derogatory expression. And that's the expression of mitzvat anashim melumada. People do mitzvahs out of habit. So robotically. And there are many people like that. They might be observant, quote unquote, religious, or however you may call that. Those labels don't mean much. But they do that robotically. They pray 3 times a day, but there's no passion there. It's robotic. They do this, they do that. They know how to check all the boxes. But that's one of the worst levels. The opposite of that is a chassid. Someone who goes all the way with all of his passion, with all of his heart, because it's not about checking boxes. It's about a relationship in which I'm madly in love. And therefore I go all the way. But that's what a chassid is, just to explain this a little bit more. Love to hear your voices, your comments, your disagreements, etc. Otherwise we can continue. No, okay, so let's continue towards
Towards his
page
nest.
262 here, towards his nest.
Yes, towards his nest, uniting the Holy One, blessed be he, and his Shekhinah within the nethermost worlds. The word Zohar uses for his owner is kono, a common euphemism for God, which also can be rendered his nest. That is the divine place of dwelling. Thus, the Zohar further develops its interpretation of chassid as one whose benevolence toward God is expressed in an endeavor to restore the integrity of God's nest. The divine nest, as Rabbi Shmuel Brunim explains in his elucidations of Tanya, is the Shekhinah, the divine immanence that dwells within the created reality. By creating the world, God, in effect, separated the Holy One, the divine reality that presents creation, from the Shekhinah, the divine presence within creation. God's desire is that man should unite the two. Every mitzvah performed by man is an act of repairing the so-called breach in the divine reality.
Right. Just finish that one more paragraph here.
For the complete tzaddik, the fulfillment of this divine wish eclipses everything else. He completely forgets his own soul's craving and desires. Indeed, his very sense of self in the endeavor to unite the Holy One and his Shekhinah. Right,
and that's just a beautiful, if you think about this, if you chew on this, it's just so powerful because, again, he's benevolent towards his creator, and yet the word for creator is kono, which comes from the word ken, which means towards God's, not just towards God, but towards God's nest. He's devoted towards creating a nest for God in this world, in which God can dwell, just like a bird dwells in his nest. Now, what's powerful about this is, reminds me, maybe the best way to explain this, it reminds me of that famous expression by Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Berdichev, who was really one of the most highlighted Hasidic masters of 200 years ago, a little bit more. But Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Berdichev would say that, and I think we've said this before, but would say that when it is cold, there are two ways to become warm, right? One is to wear a fur coat, another one is to ignite a fire. Wear a fur coat and you will only have warmed yourself. Ignite a fire and you will have warmed yourself and everyone around you. A chassid is someone that cares about igniting a fire, by creating a nest. It's not just about him. Many people are very much, again, observant, quote unquote, religious, but they do it for themselves, to wear a fur coat. As long as I'm protected, as long as I've checked the boxes, as long as my family is protected and blessed and does the right things, I'm okay. But that's not the chassid. That's not the chassid. That's not the tzaddik. Tzaddik doesn't just care about wearing a fur coat about himself. He cares about the nest of God. It's not about me and my little bubble. It's really about God's world and making sure that God can dwell here. So he ignites a fire wherever he goes. And I think that Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Berdichev used that metaphor also purposefully because by using the metaphor of a fire, he's also alluding to this idea that we have to have a fire burning within us. This passion, this love, this unconditional devotion and dedication, this determination and conviction, if you wish. That's really what our relationship with God is about, creating that nest with all that we have, every fiber of our being. That's why it says, again, kono. That's why it uses not just the word creator, but the word nest. And again, to translate this into practical ways, I think that we have to think each and every day, when we start the day, and certainly when we end the day, what have we done for this world? Not just for ourselves, not just to protect ourselves, as we mentioned, but what have we done for others? Have we given something to make this from within, to make this world a nest for God? Have we participated in the building of this nest, of ensuring that God feels comfortable here, can dwell here? What have we done to elevate this world, whether it's the world itself or whether people in the world? Maybe we can't do it again 24/7, but we can do it at least an hour a day, half an hour a day, 10 minutes a day. Maybe it's just a phone call. But that's really what it means to ignite a fire, to create a nest. There are two types of divine worship. One is very robotic and therefore maybe even self-serving and almost disconnected from God, even though we might think we may be doing it for God. And one is very much passionate and very much one with God. And that's the way of the chassid. And that oneness with God cares about God, not about me. I'm one with God, and therefore I care about God. So that's the idea. I also want to point out, it's quite interesting because, in Hebrew, there is no word for one life. The word for life in Hebrew is in the plural tense. lives. In every other language that I know, at least, there is a word for one life and there's a word for lives, right? How would you say it in Italian, Elisabetta?
Vita, singolare, vite, plurale.
That's it, exactly. So there you go. And in Spanish, anyone speak Spanish here or
Sì,
French?
vita también.
Yeah,
Sì,
that's right.
también.
One with the T and one with the D, right? But but
I have a question. I mean, it's not a question, it's more of
yes,
a
please.
an observation, maybe.
Yeah.
I find it interesting that he uses the word nest. He could have used the word house or place, but he says nest because nest, in my view, implies like, is where you nurture your babies, right? And
Right.
so has a connotation of love that home or place wouldn't imply. I mean, am I wrong in this?
No, very, very good. Very good. You're right. It has this connotation of nurturing, of love, of parenting.
Yes.
That's right. That's right. And in many ways, that's why this is the word that is used, because God is an ultimate loving God that wishes to nurture its children. That says we're in the period of the 3 weeks, in which we mourn really the siege of Jerusalem in the year 67 CE, and then the destruction of the temple in the year 70 CE. And first temple was also destroyed on the 9th of Av at the conclusion of this 3-week period. So it's a period that is a somber period in the Jewish calendar. Many other tragedies happened, especially on the 9th of Av, the culmination of the spirit, the last day. So it was a fast day, but we commemorate many other tragedies like the Spanish Inquisition that began on this day, the First World War that began on this day, and many other tragedies. But it's interesting because I'm thinking about this idea of nest, of nurturing, because God, when he exiled the Jewish people, it says, V'shav Hashem Elokecha et shvutecha, that God will return. At the end, when the redemption will come, which hopefully will happen even today, then God will return with his people. So immediately the commentaries point out, 1 second, it doesn't say that God will make his people return. It says that God will return with his people. God is also in exile. God is also suffering. Just like that bird that is one with his chicks, right? That loving relationship. And that's really, when we're in pain, God is also in pain. Now, we don't always understand, then why do you create pain altogether? That's the ultimate question that has no answer. But God also suffers. Be'et tzaratam lo tsar, the prophet says in Jeremiah, that in their suffering, lo tsar, God also suffers. To him also there's suffering. So there's that ultimate relationship that God also has with us, like a bird to its chicks in a nest, and that's a good point. But going back to this idea of life, so the word is lives, not one life. There is no word for one life. You might say chai. Chai is the verb. It's not the noun. The reason again is because you've only truly lived if you've lived in a plural tense, right? If you've impacted others, influenced others, if you touched others, then you've lived. If you've been other oriented, you've lived. If you've lived selfishly just to yourself, you really haven't lived. And that's really what the ultimate tzaddik does all the time. He's so devoted to the nest of God that he's always other-oriented. He's always chaim, living in the plural tense. It's never about him. So again, we can't do this 24/7, but we can do it at least, I don't know, a few minutes a day. We can start there and then increase that. Yeah.
I want to ask a question.
Yes, please, William.
We're talking about nurturing. We're
Mhm.
talking about devotion, clinging to God. How do you feel about there's yeshivot in New York who have been not teaching, they've been criticized for not teaching secular subjects, and their students, once they graduate, they fail in the real world. They cannot advance in many ways. A lot of them end up on welfare because they do not have a secular education. I think it's great to to have a devotion, but I think you have to be more conscious than just one aspect of devotion. You have to create a human being who could function in the real world too.
Right. So I'm not going to go into that whole subject, even though there's voices here and there. I just read an article by Liel Leibovitz. I would encourage you to read it about this subject. But I will say that I think one of the great tragedies is when we compartmentalize God into and make him belong just to the synagogues or just to the yeshivas. When God belongs in a truck or in a factory or in a bedroom just as much. And when we speak of devotion to God, oneness with God, it's exactly what we mean. If God is one, if God is all-encompassing, God is the master of the entire universe, that means that God is part of the synagogues just as much as he's part of our kitchen. After all this is the universe. And to compartmentalize God and make him just a part of the Torah studied in yeshivas, or the prayer prayed in synagogues, is, I think, a very big travesty. I remember what Rabbi Steinsaltz would often say, that sometimes a prayer driving down the highway is just as powerful as a prayer in synagogue for 3 hours. Because if I'm praying right there in the car and opening myself up to God, I'm inviting God to my car, to the highway itself. God is there too. It's not just in the synagogue. I remember that. And I mentioned this before, but I remember that I was with him when he addressed the crowd in Teaneck, New Jersey, in this big synagogue. And I forget the name of the synagogue, but he said to the crowd there, look, I have but one request for you. Don't treat God as some people here in this country treat their parent when they become old. Because very often, people, what do they do to their parent and become old? He said, they lock him up in the house, him or her, the father or the mother in the house, and they visit him from time to time. God doesn't need to be locked up in a synagogue and you visit him from time to time. Take God with you. Bring him with you to every place you go to, whether it's to your workplace, to your home, okay, to your bedroom, to your kitchen, to your dining room, to wherever you go, bring God with you. That's where he belongs. And that's what we mean by cleaving to God, oneness with God. That God doesn't just belong there. He belongs here, right now, with me, wherever I am. To quote again, King David in Psalm 139, which, by the way, the Ibn Ezra, one of the great Spanish poets, Jewish Spanish Sephardic poets of the 11th century, who had a very troubled life. And so he knew what it meant to have a relationship with God wherever you are. He was impoverished his whole life. He was exiled from place to place. He ended up in France, in England, back to Italy. Was born in Spain, but was all over the place. He had just a horrific life. But he says that Psalm 139, this psalm that I'm about to quote, is the most important psalm in the entire book of Psalms. And there's a verse there that says, Im esak shamayim sham'ata, v'atzia sheol ineka. If I will soar to the heavens, there you are. But if I go down to the abyss, to hell, there you are too. God is everywhere. Ana mipanecha evrach. How can I flee from you? Because you're everywhere. Whether it's in the highest of heavens and the lowest of lows. God is everywhere. And God expects us to connect to him everywhere, because he's everywhere. So to compartmentalize God just to yeshivas, I think, is really a travesty. People can be, working, even physical labor. They could be movers, okay? They could be factory workers, and they could be as devoted to God as a person who locks himself up in yeshiva and studies Torah all day long, maybe even more devoted. Because the person in yeshiva is leaving God in his yeshiva box. This factory worker is bringing God down to the factory, to the lowest levels of the world, where without this person, God would not have been drawn down. So maybe he's on a higher level of connection. And that's really what the complete tzaddik does. Again, he creates a nest everywhere, not just where it's comfortable, everywhere. That's really the idea. So I'm glad you brought this up, William, because it's important to remember. God doesn't belong to any place or to any time or to any day, even not just Shabbat, every day of the week. He belongs everywhere at all times. And we have to create a nest for him, therefore, everywhere at all times.